$1.2 billion. That is the compensation Coupang pledged to 33.7 million customers after a massive data breach, roughly 1.7 trillion won, or about $1.17 billion in customer compensation vouchers disclosed in SEC filings and follow-on reporting. The breach was not a perimeter intrusion. A former employee retained system access through an unrevoked security key, and approximately 33.7 million accounts were accessed over months. Corroborating reporting indicated that data was saved from only about 3,000 of those accounts and subsequently deleted before regulators confirmed the wider scope. For a US-listed e-commerce operator scaled to South Korean logistics dominance, the failure was deceptively simple. Credential lifecycle discipline broke before any advanced detection layer mattered. Names, email addresses, delivery addresses, phone numbers, order histories, and even shared apartment building entrance passwords were affected at a scale large enough to trigger regulatory scrutiny, public backlash, and a diplomatic dispute between Seoul and Washington. This hack debrief maps the defensive failure, how trusted access persisted, how long it went undetected, and why the $1.2 billion compensation figure became the headline investors could not ignore. That sprawling foundation was, by design, a paradox. A South Korean e-commerce giant, US-listed and incorporated in Delaware, built on customer data and growing at breakneck speed. Coupang's ambition was total logistical supremacy in South Korea. It built a dense, proprietary network of fulfillment centers and delivery drivers, promising something no Korean retailer had ever offered: dawn-to-doorstep speed, at scale. Its customer base reached tens of millions of accounts. The press crowned it the Amazon of South Korea, and the name stuck because it fit. The company's identity was velocity. Products to doorsteps faster than anyone. Infrastructure scaling as fast as demand. It was a strategic triumph. By scaling its infrastructure aggressively, Coupang built a moat that competitors couldn't easily cross. Every new warehouse was a declaration: we're not going anywhere. But the strategy had a blind spot baked into its DNA. Operational speed came first. Security credentials accumulated without proper oversight. Digital signing keys lingered in systems long after employees departed, and authentication controls became harder to audit. The very infrastructure that enabled dominance became its greatest liability. While executives tracked logistics and market share, governance gaps accumulated silently in the background. Credential and security key management had not kept pace with the company's growth. And in cybersecurity, speed without access governance is just a faster path to failure. The first critical security alerts were already being logged, and one, in particular, would leave 33 million customer accounts accessed and trigger a record regulatory response. After the breach, Coupang poured capital back into the engine, not into a vault, but into cybersecurity infrastructure, customer compensation, and operational remediation at national scale. The mandate was clear: widen the moat, fortify operations, and keep delivery speed as the competitive weapon. A meaningful share of that investment flowed toward defense. Information security spending rose 51.6% in 2025, reaching approximately $86.6 million, the first time security outlays crossed 100 billion won. Security headcount grew roughly 75%, later expanding toward 370 dedicated personnel. On quarterly reports, the numbers told a story of vigilance. More budget, more staff, more monitoring contracts, but this is where the narrative of control fractures. Pouring money into the ramparts is one thing. Making sure departed employees lose their keys is another. While external cybersecurity firms Mandiant, Palo Alto Networks, and Ernst & Young were commissioned for forensic investigation, the most basic control, revoking credentials at offboarding, still depended on manual, error-prone processes. The company's sprawling footprint had outgrown its identity lifecycle discipline. The most sophisticated surveillance is rendered useless by a single trusted session that should have expired months earlier. Coupang was building a wall of budget. The breach would walk through a forgotten door. November 2025. The first alert arrived the way they always do: quiet, almost routine, an unauthorized access event. Approximately 4,500 user accounts touched. For a company processing millions of transactions daily, this was the kind of anomaly that gets triaged into the manageable pile. The initial assumption pointed to a routine perimeter event. It wasn't. The investigation pivoted fast. No external actor had brute-forced a perimeter control in this narrative. The point of compromise was far more mundane and far more damning. It was a stolen signing key, credentials from a former employee. Ones that should have been revoked months earlier. Still active. Still trusted. Those keys didn't just open a door, they opened every door. Unauthorized authentication tokens that allowed trusted access inside internal systems. All that security spending, outwitted by a credential nobody remembered to revoke. Forensic review traced how the session moved across internal systems, and the true scale emerged. The initial 4,500 accounts were just the entry point. The former employees' retained access ultimately reached 33.7 million customer accounts. Names, contact details, order histories. Accessed Coupang initially characterized the initial scope as limited, but government investigations found over 33.6 million accounts accessed. A breach measured not in thousands, but in a number equivalent to roughly 2/3 of South Korea's entire population. The technical failure was compounded by reporting timing. South Korean rules require rapid notification once scope is known. Coupang's delay in confirming the full account count and notifying authorities extended the crisis beyond access control into compliance scrutiny. What began as an insider access failure became a governance test with regulatory consequences, but the financial remediation was about to become even larger. Once the scope was public, Coupang's response shifted from containment to customer remediation. In SEC disclosures and corroborating reporting, the company described roughly 1.7 trillion won, about $1.17 billion, commonly summarized as $1.2 billion, in compensation vouchers for users affected by the incident. The number investors heard was not a hacker's ransom. It was a customer compensation envelope tied to 33 million accounts accessed. Regulators investigated reporting timelines and access control failures, while Coupang apologized publicly and pledged stronger safeguards. The domestic process ran in parallel with a sharper international argument. Coupang, incorporated in Delaware and listed in New York, spent more than $1 million on U.S. lobbying after November 2025. A House Judiciary Committee report alleged discriminatory enforcement against an American-owned firm. Seoul called its investigation lawful and non-discriminatory. The same insider access incident was now a trade politics flashpoint. A credential lifecycle failure was being argued in two capitals at once. Three fronts converged. Customers demanding accountability. Regulators testing whether controls failed before capital did. Diplomats arguing over whether enforcement was protection or prejudice. Through it all, the defensive lesson stayed constant. Revoke access at offboarding, monitor insider sessions, and treat identity hygiene as production infrastructure, not paperwork filed after someone leaves. Coupang increased information security spending by 51.6% to approximately $86.6 million and expanded security staffing to around 370 personnel. Reactive investment mattered, but it could not unwind 33.7 million accounts already accessed. The $1.2 billion compensation pledge made that scale legible to markets in a way no incident ticket ever could. The final stage of any incident response is fallout. For Coupang, this wasn't a cleanup. It was an autopsy performed on a living patient. The incident did not begin with a sophisticated external intrusion playbook. It began with a failure of the most basic security principle, revoking access for a former employee. A single, unrevoked credential. That's what left 33.7 million customer accounts accessed. In the aftermath, Coupang pledged roughly $1.2 billion, about 1.7 trillion won in compensation vouchers, while expanding security staffing and spend. Information security outlays reached approximately $86.6 million, up 51.6%, with headcount moving toward 370 personnel. Necessary moves, but throwing bodies and budget at a governance failure is like repainting a house with a cracked foundation. And then the secondary damage began, the kind no firewall could stop. Coupang's dual identity, an American corporation operating almost exclusively on Korean soil, created a vulnerability no security team could have modeled in a tabletop exercise. The breach became fuel for a geopolitical argument. A U.S. House Judiciary Committee report accused Seoul of discriminatory enforcement. South Korea fired back, calling its investigation lawful and non-discriminatory. A domestic access control failure was now a fault line running through one of the most critical alliances in the Pacific. 1. Retained Credential. 2. Governments. A diplomatic crisis no penetration test could have predicted. The strategic lesson here is not about budget alone. It is about the chasm between operational velocity and governance maturity. Coupang moved fast. That was always its superpower. But in a globalized economy, the attack surface is political as much as it is technical. A lapse in basic process didn't just leave customer data accessed. It handed leverage to state actors in a contested jurisdiction. The company wasn't just fighting to restore trust anymore. It was navigating a political crisis it had inadvertently built. Before we close, this analysis is educational only and does not provide attack instructions or technical steps. If this breakdown of corporate risk provided value, your support helps us produce future analyses. So here is the question worth sitting with. What is the single greatest security challenge for companies that operate across multiple, conflicting regulatory jurisdictions? Because Coupang's story suggests the answer isn't only technical, it's structural. And by the time you realize that, the damage has already gone international. If this breach analysis helped you understand the vulnerability, a like helps us reach more curious minds. What do you think is the most critical lesson from this breach? Drop your take in the comments,